I am the author of 3 books, the most recent of which is Weird Moments in Cleveland Sports. It is the longest book that I have written because Weird Moments in Cleveland Sports is such a deep well to mine.
Now, you are an award-winning sports journalist.
Yeah, sure, we'll go with that.
With a vast repository of both local history and sports knowledge.
So far, so good.
With all of that in mind, why focus on the weird?
Because the stuff that occurs naturally isn't quite as interesting. It's one thing to say, I went to a game where I saw somebody hit 3 home runs. It is something else entirely to say, I went to a game where the ball bounced off the right fielder's head and went over the fence for a home run.
How much investigation did it take to identify the stories that you wanted for the book?
Well, I have been a Cleveland sports fan for most of my existence, so I kind of knew at least the stuff that had occurred in my lifetime. But, you know, I had done a bunch of research on a variety of topics, and some of them I just stumbled onto. Some of them were just kind of presented to me, like, you know, hey, did you know that Frank Robinson once got in a fight with a pitcher for the Indians AAA affiliate during an exhibition game? And I said, no, and now I must know more about that.
Who won that fight?
Frank Robinson. I believe the accounts the next day said that he threw 3 punches and knocked the other guy out so fast that the dugouts didn't have time to empty.
He might have been a better boxer than coach. How did you research the stories once you knew what you wanted to write about?
Well, this was my pandemic project. I was very fortunate. My wife and I both stayed healthy. We both continued to work, but I had a lot of free time. There were no sporting events for me to watch, and I kind of put together an outline. Like most great works of literature, this was crowdsourced on Twitter. And from there, I was able to do really a lot of remote research because obviously this was during the plague and a lot of libraries were closed. So there were limitations, but at the same time, there were places where I didn't have to go anywhere. I'm a member of the Society for American Baseball Research. That gave me access to a variety of research sources. You can read the Cleveland Plain Dealer online. It is digitized and searchable through the Cleveland Public Library. And I was able to find a lot of the stuff that I was looking for.
Of all the many anecdotes you collected, what was the most difficult to find information on?
The most difficult to find accurate information on was, surprisingly enough, 10-cent beer night. The game was not televised. It was on the radio, but there's not a lot of existing tape of the radio, at least not for public consumption. I'm sure somebody has it reel to reel somewhere. And there were a lot of people who, for reasons that should be apparent, might be unreliable narrators in this story.
Why does 10-cent beer night riots still fascinate us so much?
Well, I think part of it is we just had the 50th anniversary, and that made it a topic ripe for TV specials and articles and things like that. But it's one of those things that I feel like there's an inordinate amount of people who want to be associated with it. I wrote a feature for Cleveland Magazine for the 50th anniversary. One of the people I got to talk to before he died was John Adams, the guy with the drum. And he says, down through the years, 620,000 people have told me they were at 10-cent beer night. And it's just one of those things that's so strange that everybody wants to be some part of it or to know more about it.
It's like everybody was at Lynn's Perfect Game.
That was the other thing John Adams said. He said 620,000 people were at 10-cent beer night and 720,000 people were at Len Barker's Perfect Game.
Is there a story that you wished you could have included in your book, but you ran out of pages?
I don't think I ran out of pages. It's just that sometimes there were things that occurred to me later on. And the one that still bugs me, I did a whole chapter called Wait, That Guy Was Here. And it's about all of the people that were famous elsewhere that at one point or another were in Cleveland. Chuck Daly, very briefly, was the Cleveland Cavaliers coach. Bill Laimbeer very briefly played for the Cavaliers. There was the whole Keith Hernandez experiment in the 1980s. Len Dawson very briefly played for the Browns. Walt Frazier ended his career in Cleveland with the Cavaliers. There was one player that I kicked myself for not including later on, and that was Roger Maris. Roger Maris played for the Indians. He was traded in, I think it was an 8-player trade to the Athletics when they were still in Kansas City. And the Athletics at that point were essentially a farm team for the Yankees. The owner was a guy by the name of Arnold Johnson, and he was essentially installed by the Yankees ownership, and he just kept dealing all of these players to New York. And sure enough, Kansas City ended up with Roger Maris, and a year later, he was a Yankee.
Okay, so I'm honestly surprised by how many of the stories in Weird Moments happened recently. Perhaps this is just my own bias, but I'm not surprised when weird stories come out of the Cleveland Spiders or the Cleveland Rams era. Why has Cleveland sports stayed so strange?
Well, you know, it's kind of funny. I am a child of the 1980s, and so I remember when the Indians were really, really bad. I mean, they made Major League about the Indians for a reason. And I can still remember watching the games on 43, and they'd say, plenty of good seats still available, like 10 minutes before first pitch. Cavaliers were not great in the early 80s. The Cavaliers were great for a little while in the 80s and into the early 90s, and then kind of sank into mediocrity. But boy, since they came back in 1999, the Browns have just been a gift that keeps on giving for a book like this. They are also such a deep well from which to draw. This is a team, and I swear to you this is true, they have lost 3 different games when they were leading when the clock struck 0 in the fourth quarter. They lost 3 different games on an untimed down because of a defensive penalty. Right? Like they said one year in Deadspin, yeah, the Browns went 0-16, but every season is an 0-16 season in spirit in Cleveland.
That hits closer to the center of the bullseye than I care to admit.
I know.
Okay, so you talk about the midge swarm that defeated Jaga Chamberlain.
I do.
And on a very related note, what is your favorite insect?
My favorite insect? Boy, that's a really tough question. Probably bees, because they give us honey.
Okay, the correct answer was the baseball bug.
And I talked to him, so he's going to be upset about this. I wrote a piece for an Indians blog about the baseball bug, and he found me, and so he's telling me stories about the costume. He was a student in college at the time. He said, yeah, I can do this for a few extra bucks, because I think he was a gymnast in high school, maybe in college too, so he had that kind of dexterity for the part. And my favorite thing that he told me, and this did not make the book, he said George Steinbrenner tried to have him banned from Cleveland Stadium when the Yankees were in town.
Why?
Apparently he was too obnoxious for George Steinbrenner.
Considering some of the people who have played for George, that's a pretty astonishing...
Right, that does seem like a high bar to clear.
It doesn't surprise me that the bug had a gymnast background. He would have never slipped off the dugout.
No, and that also comes up in the book. And if you ever get a chance to, find the clip on video, because they will still show it. And it was a playoff game. It was the championship series against the Mariners. And Slider slipped off the wall out in right field. And the game was on NBC. So it was, I believe, it was Bob Costas and Bob Uecker calling the game. And Costas is yelling about Slider on the field like the Hindenburg is crashing.
I have good news for you.
What's that?
We have made it through all the questions you've been asked a million times, and we've reached the lightning round.
All right, let's do it.
1, who is the worst team owner in Cleveland sports history?
Art Modell.
2, what does the Kelsey cereal taste like?
It really hits my inner 10-year-old. It's Reese Puffs, Lucky Charms, and Cinnamon Toast Crunch.
Who is your favorite Simpsons sports cameo?
Mike Scioscia, just because they brought him back years later on an episode. And it was the episode where Lisa was the manager. And Bill James made a cameo in that episode. And he said, I made baseball as fun as doing your taxes. But they run into Mike Scioscia later on, and Marge says, didn't you get radiation poisoning? And he said, yes, and it gave me super managing skills.
What's your favorite room in the Cleveland Public Library?
Probably the microfilm room, because that's my idea of a good time.
Besides the one you wrote, which is objectively perfect.
Well, that's nice of you to say.
It's objective. It's scientific. What are your favorite local sports books?
I am a big fan of Dan Coughlin's collections. He's another great publishing author, and he actually said he enjoyed the book, which is, praise from Caesar. My friend and colleague Jim Ingram wrote a biography of Mike Hargrove, and I recently read Our Team by Luke Eplin about the 1948 Indians, and it reaches depths of research that I don't know that I had ever seen before of a book of that nature, because everybody writes about the other teams of that era. David Halberstam wrote about the Indians or the Yankees and the Red Sox of that era, and in fact he was supposed to write about the Giants and the Colts. He actually died before he could complete that book on the NFL championship. But the 48 Indians are not something that people get deep into. And Jonathan Knight wrote a book called Summer of Shadows, which I thought was just a great melding of 1954, talking at length about the Indians on their way to 111 wins and the Maryland Shepard murder. And he makes it work.
Those are all my questions. Is there anything else you'd like to add?
No, nothing comes immediately to mind other than please check out or buy Weird Moments in Cleveland Sports. It is a great publishing book. It is available through their website and anywhere else that fine literature is sold.